Wisconsin dairy farmers have spent years trying to sell more into the country next door. This month, they found out exactly how far that's going to get them. Nowhere. Canada just told Washington in plain terms that its dairy market is not opening any further. Not for this trade deal, not for this deadline, not for anyone. If you've got a mortgage tied to a farm, a paycheck tied to a co-op, or a grocery bill that keeps climbing no matter what the politicians promise, this is one of the quiet reasons why. Subscribe before we get into this because what's actually happening at this border looks nothing like what either government is saying about it in public. And drop a comment right now. Does a 60-year-old farm policy get to hold an entire trade relationship hostage? Let's get into it. Start with what Canada is actually protecting, because almost nobody explains this part clearly. It's called supply management, and it is one of the strangest surviving relics in the developed world's trade architecture. Canada sets a national production quota for dairy, eggs, and poultry. It fixes the price farmers get paid, and it caps how much of those products can cross the border from anywhere else, including the United States, before a punishing tariff kicks in. No auction, no open market, no race to the bottom on price. A government-run ceiling built in the 1970s, still standing today, protecting roughly 10,000 dairy farms scattered mostly across Ontario and Quebec. Almost no other wealthy country still runs a system like this at this scale. The United States doesn't. Most of Europe doesn't. Australia dismantled its own version decades ago. Canada, Japan, and a handful of others are the last holdouts, and Canada's version is the one Washington keeps running into over and over, negotiation after negotiation, because it touches the one sector where Canada has consistently refused to budge no matter what else is on the table. Three moving parts hold it up. A production quota that tells every Canadian farm exactly how much it's allowed to produce. A fixed minimum price that guarantees what farmers get paid regardless of global market swings. And a tariff rate quota at the border, a small amount of foreign product allowed in at a normal rate. And then a wall, a tariff north of 200% on anything above that ceiling. It isn't subtle. It's a hard stop dressed up in bureaucratic language. For decades, Washington treated this as an annoyance, not a fight worth having. That changed this year. As part of the new 50% tariff set to hit Canadian goods on August 19th, the White House named 3 specific irritants driving the decision. Not 10, not 20, 3. Automobiles, alcoholic beverages, and dairy. Out of every category of trade dispute the two countries could have picked, dairy made the short list. That alone should tell you this isn't a minor sideshow anymore. Put a number on the scale of what's actually riding on this. That 50% tariff covers roughly $20 billion worth of Canadian goods crossing into the United States. Autos, alcohol, and dairy combined, somewhere around 5% of everything Canada ships south in a normal year. It's not the whole trade relationship. It's a targeted strike at 3 specific sectors Washington decided were worth naming individually, out of thousands of categories it could have picked instead. Dairy sitting on that short list, next to entire automobile and alcohol industries worth vastly more in raw dollar terms, is itself the tell. It's not there because of its size. It's there because of what it represents, a market Washington has been trying to pry open for years and hasn't managed to move an inch. So Washington asked Canada to open the gate wider. And this week, Canada's answer arrived loud and unambiguous from 2 directions at once. Federal Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc reaffirmed that supply management is being treated as a non-negotiable cornerstone of the country's rural economy, off the table entirely in these talks. And in Quebec, where roughly half of Canada's dairy farms are concentrated, the provincial government made clear it will not accept any deal that touches the system, regardless of what Ottawa is willing to trade away elsewhere. 2 governments, federal and provincial, drawing the exact same line in the same week. That's not posturing. That's a wall going up on purpose. Now here's where this story splits into 2 very different tellings, and only one of them is honest. The version making the rounds says Canada slams the door shut, period, end of story. That version is wrong, and it's wrong in a way that actually makes the real story more interesting. American dairy exports into Canada did not shrink under this system. They grew. Between 2019 and 2025, U.S. dairy exports crossing into Canada expanded by roughly 150%, climbing past 1 billion Canadian dollars. That is not a closed market. That is a market opening, just slowly, just partially, just nowhere near fast enough for the industry actually trying to sell into it. Sit with that number for a second because it's the whole story in miniature. 150% growth should be a win. In Wisconsin, it barely registers because the quota ceiling above that growth never moved. American producers aren't losing a market. They're standing outside a market that keeps getting a little bigger on the inside while the door stays exactly the same width. Growth without access is just a longer line at a gate that was never going to open all the way. And that gate has a real cost attached to it, paid by a specific, identifiable group of people. Wisconsin brands its own license plates, America's Dairyland. It is the top cheese-producing state in the country, home to family operations that have been shipping milk and cheese for generations, and it sits at the exact center of the national conversation about who gets hurt when trade deals stall. Wisconsin is also one of the most closely watched swing states in American politics, which means every stalled negotiation here gets read twice, once as an economic story, once as a political one. Farmers in this state didn't ask to become a bargaining chip in a fight over cars and whiskey. They became one anyway, because their industry was the one Washington chose to name out loud. The U.S. Department of Agriculture and the U.S. Dairy Export Council have both been tracking this exact friction point for years, flagging Canada's tariff rate quota system as one of the most restrictive market access structures the U.S. dairy sector faces anywhere in the world. Groups representing Wisconsin producers have pushed the same argument through years of trade negotiations, through the original USMCA talks, through this year's review, and the answer from Ottawa hasn't changed. It's the same answer, delivered a little more firmly each time. No. And here's the detail that makes this year different from every year before it. This isn't the first round of this exact fight. Back in 2020, when the original USMCA deal was being finalized, Canada did move a little. It agreed to open small new tariff rate quotas specifically for American dairy, the first real crack in the wall in a generation. And that's part of why the 150% growth number exists at all. It's not organic market expansion. It's the direct result of that one negotiated concession, which tells you the wall isn't actually immovable. It has moved before, under enough pressure, at exactly one moment when both governments needed a deal badly enough to trade something real. The question hanging over this entire standoff is whether August 19th produces that same kind of pressure, or whether this time Ottawa decides the tariff threat alone isn't enough to make it worth reopening a fight with Quebec. Here's the part almost nobody connects, and it's worth pausing on, because it changes how permanent this fight might actually be. This is not the first time the United States has let a narrow agricultural trade dispute turn into a tariff that outlives the argument that created it. In 1963, West Germany and other European nations restricted American poultry imports, protecting their own farmers from cheaper U.S. chicken. Washington retaliated the following year with tariffs on a handful of European goods, brandy, potato starch, and, almost as an afterthought, light trucks. The poultry dispute itself faded from memory within a few years. The truck tariff did not. 25% still standing, more than 60 years later. It has shaped what pickup trucks and vans get built in America, imported into America, or quietly stripped down and reassembled just to dodge it, all because of a fight over chicken that most people alive today have never heard of. Trade lawyers still call it the chicken tax to this day, and it hasn't just survived, it's actively shaped decisions inside American car companies for decades. For years, one automaker imported a European-built van as a finished passenger vehicle, seats and all, to sidestep the truck tariff, then stripped the seats out and sent them to scrap the moment the van cleared customs, all because the paperwork classification mattered more than the actual product underneath it. That's what a narrow, forgotten trade grievance does when nobody ever circles back to remove it. It stops being about the original dispute entirely and starts quietly warping the decisions of an entire industry, year after year, long after everyone who argued about the original chickens has retired. That's the risk sitting underneath the dairy standoff right now. Tariffs justified by one specific grievance have a documented history of outliving that grievance by decades. Nobody in 1964 thought they were writing a rule that would still be shaping the auto industry in the 2020s. And nobody negotiating this dairy fight in 2026 can promise it won't do the same thing to agricultural trade for the next 2 generations. Follow the money a little further, and the picture gets more complicated, not less. Canada's own trade minister isn't hiding the fact that supply management protects roughly 10,000 farms, a genuinely small slice of Canada's overall economy, against an American market of over 330 million consumers. From a pure numbers standpoint, it looks like an easy trade to make. But supply management isn't just an economic policy in Canada. It's treated as a piece of rural identity, a promise made to specific regions, specific provinces, specific families, going back 2 generations. Quebec alone holds close to half the country's dairy farms, and no federal government in Ottawa has survived very long after picking a fight with Quebec's agricultural base. That's the part American trade negotiators consistently underestimate. This was never purely an economic calculation for Canada. It's a political survival calculation, and those don't move for tariff deadlines. Carney's own government has extra reasons to feel that pressure right now. Recent polling shows confidence in his ability to actually deliver a strong outcome from these trade talks has been sliding, not climbing, over the past few months. A government already fielding questions about whether it can hold its own line with Washington cannot afford to be the government that also caved on dairy, not with Quebec holding the seats it needs, and not with an opposition already circling, demanding a full accounting of the negotiating strategy. Every incentive inside Ottawa right now points toward holding the wall, not lowering it, regardless of what it costs on the other side of the border. Which brings us to August 19th, now closing fast. That's the date the 50% tariff takes effect on Canadian autos, alcohol, and dairy, the same 3 categories named as the justification for the whole action. If Canada's position on dairy hasn't shifted by then, and every signal out of Ottawa and Quebec this week says it hasn't, dairy stays exactly where it started, protected, capped, unmoved, while the tariff clock runs out around it. Wisconsin's growers don't get a bigger door. They get a 50% tariff wall going up on the other side of the same gate that was already too narrow, with no clear connection between the punishment and the actual product it's meant to punish. This sits inside a bigger, messier picture, too. Just weeks before this dairy standoff hardened, the broader trade agreement between the 2 countries wasn't renewed at its scheduled review point on July 1st. It didn't collapse. It stays in force, technically, until 2036. But it also didn't get the fresh commitment either government could have used to signal real momentum. Instead, both countries are now working through a slower, less certain annual review process with no fixed timeline for when the next real decision point arrives. Dairy is just the sharpest, most public example of a much wider stall. 2 governments talking, technically still bound to each other, agreeing on almost nothing that actually moves. So what happens to the price on your shelf while all of this holds? Not much, immediately, and that's part of what makes this story easy to overlook. This isn't a shock event like a factory closing overnight. It's a slow bleed. Wisconsin producers keep operating at the ceiling supply management allows them, no higher, regardless of how much American demand for access grows. Every year that ceiling doesn't move is a year of foregone growth that never shows up as a dramatic headline, just as a slightly smaller number on an export report nobody outside the industry reads closely. Multiply that across a decade, and you get a market that could have been meaningfully bigger, quietly capped the entire time by a policy neither government is currently willing to touch. It shows up somewhere else too, somewhere much more visible. Specialty cheese is Wisconsin's signature dairy export, the product the state has spent generations building an identity around, and it's exactly the category best positioned to grow fastest into a market like Canada's, if the quota ceiling above it ever actually moved. Instead, that growth stays capped at the same rate as everything else, regardless of how much specific demand exists for it on the other side of the border. It's not that the product isn't wanted. It's that the door was never built wide enough to let the demand through, no matter how loudly it knocks. Here's what's actually worth watching over the next 3 weeks. Whether Washington treats the August 19th deadline as a hard trigger or another moment to extend and negotiate further, the way past deadlines in this same trade relationship have bent before. Whether Quebec's political weight inside Ottawa's federal coalition hardens further as the deadline approaches, or whether some quiet, narrower carve-out gets floated that lets both sides claim a partial win. And whether Wisconsin's own political weight, heading toward another closely watched election cycle, turns this from an agricultural trade footnote into something candidates are forced to answer for directly, on camera, by name. If you're sitting at home wondering what any of this actually means for you personally, here's the honest translation. It's not going to show up as a sudden spike on a receipt next month. It's going to show up as absence, the specialty cheese that never quite gets cheaper, the export contract a Wisconsin co-op never quite gets to sign, the modest, boring compounding version of a cost that never makes it into a single dramatic headline. Because it's not one event. It's a decade of foregone growth happening quietly in the background while the actual news cycle moves on to something louder. None of that is settled yet. What is settled is this. A supply management system built in the 1970s to protect roughly 10,000 Canadian farms is now, in 2026, standing directly in the way of a tariff deadline, a stalled continental trade review, and a slow compounding cost sitting on America's own dairy producers. In a state that built its entire identity around the industry, now stuck waiting at the gate. Growth without access. A wall that never fully opened, even while the number of trucks lined up in front of it kept climbing. And a 60-year-old precedent sitting quietly in the background, reminding anyone paying attention that once one of these tariffs goes up over a fight this narrow, it has a documented history of never coming back down. That's where this stands right now. If this kind of grounded fact-first breakdown is what you come here for, subscribe because this deadline isn't finished playing out, and neither is this story. Drop a comment below. If you were a Wisconsin dairy farmer watching this unfold, would you want your government fighting harder for market access or walking away from the table entirely? Let me know, and I'll see you in the next one.